Since it is mentioned I'm a Hoosier, I have to tell you just how Hoosier I am. And since we're taking surveys this morning, I will take my own survey. How many of you have seen the movie Hoosiers? I was at the game on which that film was based. Now, I know 11 million people claim to have been in the Butler Fieldhouse that night, but I was actually one of about 15,000. However, I'm happy to report I was only 10 at the time. I didn't know all the sociological or artistic implications of the victory of the Milan Indians over the evil Muncie Central Bearcats, who, of course, got renamed in the movie. And I'm on my way to Hoosierland tomorrow, in fact, even though I've lived in upstate New York for almost 50 years, because Wabash is playing its great football game against its rival DePaul, and I've just got to be there for one more humiliation of our foe. Every year I say that in case this is my last. I want to do it again. I cannot resist the temptation to read what Tocqueville wrote in his journal on November 6, 1831, in Philadelphia, exactly 181 years before the election that took place 3 days ago. These are his words. Why, as civilization spreads in America, do outstanding men become fewer? Why, when attainments are the lot of all, do great intellectual talents become rarer? Why, when knowledge of how to rule reaches the masses, is there a lack of great abilities in the direction of society? America clearly poses these questions, but who can answer them? It is indeed a provocative question for us to think about. We know that so many elements of the American experience raise such extraordinary questions, and as always, we in academia know there are more questions than answers. Tocqueville does not really have a systematic statement or chapter about education in Democracy in America. From his writings, it would be hard to be able to create a useful template to evaluate the state of education in America today. Here, however, are a few not quite random samples of what he has to say. He praises how public schools are created and that they create a literate, though not intellectually excellent, populace. He likes the local administration of schools as part of his general belief in what he calls the centralization of power, but the decentralization of administration. He is not convinced of the greatness of our universities. He states that a few excellent universities are more valuable to society than many bad colleges. He says that the strength of American education is its breadth rather than its depth. He appears to predict American predilections for melodrama and for books that simplify. To put it simply, he would not be surprised with either the Chicken Soup of the Soul or the Dummies publishing successes. He finds American thinking to be more practical and less theoretical than Europe, and he sees that as a trait of democracy. He does not think much of America as a creator of good literature or art or historical writing. America produced quantity, he said, but not very high quality. Keep in mind, he was writing in the 1830s. There has been an important American writer or two since then, I've heard. He noted that even in rustic frontier cabins, people had Bibles and newspapers, and occasionally volumes of Shakespeare. But he thought that the latter were primarily for show rather than for reading. Well, again, those are a few of his thoughts that I've gathered just simply going through and plucking out some passages in Democracy in America. But I don't want to particularly dwell on those statements. I want to go further and take a look at some of the things that I think we can deduce from Tocqueville's writings as we look to the fact that obviously education is central for him in a democratic and participatory society. It is fair to say that his ambivalence about education in America is part of his larger concern about whether democracy and excellence are compatible. He's certainly not the first person to have raised this issue. We can go back to the ancient Greeks. He certainly will not be the last. But it is, for him, important to ask this question. Does democracy mean a broadening of education that also makes it inevitably mediocre, or are democracy and excellence compatible? I think it's fair to say that for Tocqueville, the jury was still out. He does not have a definitive answer to that question, and in fact, a book of almost 700 pages basically leaves open what America is going to do with its greatness. It can develop it, or it can squander it. Yet Tocqueville does praise the schools by saying that the sum of men's education in America is directed toward politics, while in Europe, schooling is directed toward private life. Tocqueville was impressed with how knowledgeable and how articulate Americans are when talking about their laws and customs, although he does complain about what he calls America's annoying patriotism. It is vital to note that when he discusses American education for politics, he is reflecting only secondarily about schooling, for he takes seriously what we might call the value of Americans' experiential education in democracy. Tocqueville says that citizens' knowledge of law and customs comes in part from their experience in legislating. Probably he is thinking about New England town meetings and the large number of citizens who hold public office in his day because there were so many offices and such short terms. He even suggests that most Americans understand federalism. One thing that was not in the introduction that I have to confess to is that in 1998, I was a candidate for the United States Congress in Western New York. And therefore, I spent 6 months on the campaign trail and heard lots of things. I am not as convinced now as Tocqueville was then that Americans understand federalism very well. I recall more than one person saying to me something like this as I was trying to campaign on the big issues of 1998, a year you may recall in which there were no big issues. But at any rate, I can recall several people saying, you know, I'll vote for you on one condition. Sounds good to me. What is it? You fix the pothole in front of my house. And when I pointed out that Congress didn't really do potholes, even though at that time we had a senator who was nicknamed Senator Pothole in New York, Al D'Amato, people were disappointed and puzzled and then said, well, to whom do I turn? That's not good as a grade for knowledge of federalism. But Tocqueville does want to emphasize that there was a time when the public was knowledgeable and that some of that comes from their active participation as legislators, again, in sort of town meetings, and as people who held offices. Very often, much more than today, offices were held for 1 year in 1831, if you were a town commissioner or something of that sort. Tocqueville also sees juries as what he calls schools of democracy. Democracies tend to pay insufficient attention to procedure, he says, and jury experience teaches the need for established procedures. I've talked to many judges about this, and they all agree with me because one of the first things they do is explain how the jury system works and what they can and cannot listen to and take into account. And obviously, the judicial system is much more obviously and openly procedural than the other branches of government. But for Tocqueville, ultimately, citizens acquired democratic skills through three what he called intermediary institutions, that is to say, intermediary between governments far away, in my case in Albany or Washington, and governments close to the people, local government. One of these is indeed local government itself. The other two are what we would call private associations. And I want to focus on them today before I come back to schooling at the end of the talk and say something about the implications of understanding these intermediary institutions in terms of how we educate people for democracy in America. As I have mentioned, a significant number of citizens held public office in Tocqueville's time because, again, there were so many elective offices and terms were so short. Running for office was inexpensive, and holding office did not mean leaving or even interrupting one's career. Like in ancient Athens, the result was that a significant percentage of citizens in Tocqueville's America, at least for a brief time, held some public responsibility as a selectman or school board member or road commissioner or justice of the peace. This collective experience in office meant that lots of citizens had some sense of what political life was like, some sense what was possible, some sense of how things were done once you held an office of public responsibility. Today, just go into any room and say, how many of you have ever held elective office? And we will see that America is very different in that way today, whether you live in a big city or a small town. A second feature of local government was the citizens were in direct and sometimes daily contact with elected officials. They achieved some political success by directly appealing to officials as individuals and by participating in easy-to-organize groups. We all know the petition that goes down the street, will 50 people sign the petition to get the pothole fixed? That's the way potholes get fixed. At least that's true in my town in upstate New York. One fear Tocqueville had was that if governmental administration became too centralized, local governments would cease to be important, and thus decline as educational institutions for democracy. If they aren't effective, they don't serve their educational purpose in teaching people about democracy. The second intermediary institution is what he calls the political association. Everything from the NRA, I'm getting my letters confused here, to the AARP, to Save the Whales, or the snails for that matter, to local association to keep Walmart out or bring Walmart in. These institutions teach the most basic democratic skill, how to work for a common cause with people different than you. For example, let's imagine citizens forming an organization to lower the speed limit on residential streets in their towns. Today, those who participate would come from all parts of the political spectrum. They would be old and young, gay and straight, of different races and different religions. In Tocqueville's time, national political associations had both local and national meetings and appointed representatives, lobbyists, to present their views to legislators. We know that many national organizations today that could be called political associations, in fact, never meet, don't have local chapters. That would be true, for example, of the AARP to a large extent. And so Tocqueville would see that that's one of the important parts, that you actually are face-to-face with people different than you working in a common cause. I'll raise the question later whether we can do that virtually or not. To sum up, Tocqueville makes 2 points about the value of such political associations. One, successful democratic practice involves working with those different from ourselves. And two, especially with local political associations, we learn organizational and often other skills that have the chance to win us success. One person doesn't get a pothole fixed, but 50 people really can very often. Practicing democracy at state and federal levels is, as we know, less concrete and less immediate, but requires the same sort of organizational skills, though also the patience in waiting for success. We all know how rare it is today to participate in a conversation with our state and national legislators. We know that most of our letters are read and responded to by aides, often just out of or still in college. It is easy to be discouraged and leave the arena. Experience at the local level can act as a training ground and a reminder of the possibility of success, although national organizations obviously need to be structured and financed on a much more sophisticated plane. Again, we're looking at the educational tools of democracy. We start local with local political associations. The third type of intermediary institution to add to local government and political associations is what he calls the civil association. That's everything from the Rotary Club to historical societies to garden clubs to prayer circles. They have no direct political agenda and are, for Tocqueville, easy gateways in involving people in the public square. Before discussing them a bit more, let me turn for a minute to talk about what Tocqueville has to say about what I would call his great paradox of democracy. We need active participation of citizens in the civic arena, but democracy actually encourages us to retreat to private spheres because of the democratic insistence on equality. In the public sphere, we are all equal and thus without privilege. Certainly, sometimes that appears to be more true in theory than in practice, but it's something Tocqueville says we have to take very seriously. Tocqueville was probably thinking about the lack of titles and legal privileges, or perhaps even of people being expected to make certain gestures to those walking down the street of a higher status in society. He did not find that in America. But here is my more contemporary example. I attended a town meeting a few years ago called to discuss whether our town should give a zoning variance to Lowe's so that they could build a store. Many of you have probably been to meetings like this. It may be Lowe's, it may be something else. Lots of folks showed up, and I sat next to someone I often think of as the town Grinch. Now, here was the problem. Our town supervisor, New Yorkers have strange terms for every office, by the way, it's kind of our mayor. Our town supervisor announced that each person in attendance should speak for 3 minutes. I fumed because the Grinch and I had equal time. I was, of course, acting not only uncharitably, but undemocratically. But you know what goes on sometimes in your mind? By golly, in my house, I said to myself, I don't have to give equal time to people like that. People like to be treated as special. And in a democracy, we are special only, Tocqueville says, in the private context. My example. On campus, my students treat me with the proper respect and give me due deference. And at least my very young grandchildren think I'm both special and even, believe it or not, cool. Tocqueville asks, what brings people into the public sphere where they are equal rather than special? What will lure people into the town square? Government at any level may be daunting, and not everyone needs a pothole fixed or wants to battle for someone else's First Amendment rights. And therefore, Tocqueville said, everybody, however, is interested in something. Old buildings in town, brownies and Girl Scouts, planting trees on Main Street, motorcycles, stamp collecting, something. So it is easier for people to enter the public sphere via a civil association than either interacting with local government or participating in a political association. In these organizations, too, we learn to cooperate with others quite different than ourselves. Not every history nut, and I happen to be one of those, not every history nut is like me, and not every coin collector votes for the same candidate or has the same religious beliefs or sexual orientation. And he or she may even have a few body piercings. Because of the ease of joining civil associations, Tocqueville ultimately concludes that they are more important than political associations, as well as a training ground for more direct political participation in society. Someone who starts out coaching a kid's soccer team may show qualities that lead to a suggestion that he or she run for the school board. Or at least he or she may be recruited to come to a PTA meeting. A zealous restorer of historical properties may make a good assessor. Parenthetically, let me point out that Tocqueville recognized that civil associations do many things that government would be required to do without such associations. In my town, for example, the Garden Club plants flowers in the parks and along our main street, and a group called Hearthside Cats deals with stray felines. In a society with vigorous civil associations, government can get on with the things that only government can or should do. Certainly, Tocqueville realized the importance of schooling in the preparation of people for a life lived in active citizenship. However, he saw that the preparation for life as an active citizen came from experience more than from formal schooling. And this training for citizenship was stimulated by two other elements of American society during the early Republic. First, there were newspapers, lots of them. While Tocqueville did not think much of the quality of American journalism, he believed in the value of multiple newspapers where a wide variety of views was presented. In the late 19th century, my rural upstate New York county had 3 newspapers: the Livingston Democrat, the Livingston Republican, and the Livingston Independent. Because of various non-political features and different advertisements, many citizens read more than one paper, They read more than the paper that most closely corresponded to their political views. Less obviously, perhaps, the other quality conducive to the development of democratic habits, was the basic geography of everyday life. We forget about how so many of our towns and cities were set up. I live near a wonderful museum called the Geneseo Country Museum. It's one of those reassembled villages of a different period, and it happens that the one near us is assembled as an early 19th century village, that is to say, the very time that Tocqueville came to our region of America, which was the year 1831. When you go into this town, the first thing you notice is it has a town square where people talked and people listened. There was a town hall where people gathered periodically, and not always for formal government events, because the town hall was used for many private and social events as well. Inns had common tables rather than a table for two, thus placing strangers face to face over a good plate of venison stew. Larger houses had as their principal room a parlor, the very name coming from the Latin verb parlare, to speak. That we forget about the geography of democracy, and we have to ask whether we still have that geography, whether we've replaced it with a better one, whether it's possible to recreate a new kind of geography for democracy. Let me put forward some thoughts about how Tocqueville's views of the development of active and informed citizens can help us think about educating for citizenship in America almost 200 years after his historic visit. Let's begin with schools. Although Tocqueville does not discuss curriculum, I think he recognized that schools provided literacy and a basic knowledge of government and politics, and this allowed the experiential forms of the education for democracy to be effective. However, consider the real de-emphasis in recent years of what oldsters like me knew as civics, and also of the decline of history and social studies in our schools. Teachers, and even more, I think, administrators and school boards, fear the loss of public support for education if classes discuss controversial subjects. No Child Left Behind, whatever you think of it, has privileged language, math, and science because these are the subjects of the testing that determines what schools get rewarded or punished or closed. Under No Child Left Behind, states may also test for other subjects, but few have taken up that invitation from that particular piece of legislation. I fear that social studies may soon find itself along, unfortunately, with the arts in the margins of the public education of our children. Even many colleges, especially but not only two-year institutions, pay at best lip service to the idea of education for being for more than vocational training and being the engine of individual students' economic advancement. Today, most people live in places where even the most local governments are not very close to average citizens. Some states, including mine, New York, are trying to eliminate certain pieces of local government because they are cumbersome and inefficient. Without questioning the value of efficiency in government, and I like to hope nobody would seriously question that, we should not be so quick to centralize authority in ways that make local government irrelevant. Why would anyone run for office or attend a local council meeting if all the real decisions are made in Washington or, in my case, in Albany? Many good folks will not run for office or participate in local affairs if doing so is simply serving as a messenger or a branch manager for state legislatures and for Congress. Today, many people don't see elected officials in the coffee shop, if they ever go in one, or the lobby of the post office, if at least in the case of Western New York, there are any post offices left. And a much smaller percentage of people ever stand for, let alone hold office. There are more people and fewer elected officials. Unlike in Tocqueville's time, town clerks and assessors and road commissioners are more likely to be appointed than elected. Local government is much less comprehensive and effective. Local government is a much less comprehensive and effective school of democracy than it was in Tocqueville's era. We need to be quite careful before we remove or weaken government closest to and most responsive and user-friendly to ordinary citizens. That includes, of course, school boards, as well as including all kinds of other local offices. Similarly, many fewer citizens today serve on juries, another of Tocqueville's schools for democracy. This is in part because so few trials ever come before a jury. What do we lose if there are few in our midst who have had the experience of being instructed by a judge that certain procedures and safeguards have a purpose and cannot be ignored or dismissed? Perhaps we were all a bit taken aback with the conclusion Robert Putnam reached in Bowling Alone a few years ago. The title refers specifically to a kind of civil association, to use Tocqueville's language, that is to say, a bowling league. Of course, he concluded that as many people bowled now as in years past, but more people bowled alone rather than in leagues. It's important to say his findings suggest that Americans have withdrawn from some of the most important stimuli of active and effective citizenship, political and civil associations. Low voter turnout is probably in part rooted in the lack of participation in the intermediary institutions that Tocqueville emphasizes as schools for citizenship. I do not mean to sound like a grumpy old man, although I'm not ashamed of that title. And I'm not wishing for the good old days, because I'm not a pessimist. Obviously, we live in a connected world where we can watch almost any movie in our living room with the touch of a button or two, and we can, if you will, play golf, although I make my kids insert the word virtual. You can play golf or do just about anything else on your fingertips. We are not going back to the old days of gathering in the post office lobby, even if there were such things, when people flocked to various sorts of meetings in the evenings, in part because there wasn't a lot to do at home. We simply have to accept the fact the world has changed and changed greatly. We also know that schools have largely different functions than they had when Tocqueville visited America 181 years ago. They feed poor kids, are in some parents' minds free daycare, and are largely seen as being a means to economic success and social mobility, something obviously that is a good thing. However, we should never ignore the role of schooling in the shaping of an informed and active citizenry. We need history, government, and current events as part of the curriculum and at its center, not its periphery. And we need colleges and universities that recognize that education for citizenship does not end with the conferring of a high school diploma. I have to stop and give an uncompensated ad. I know you're tired of ads, at least ads that have a vaguely political tone, but my university, SUNY Geneseo, is a member of COPLAC, which to me sounds like something that probably belongs in your mouth, but nevertheless, it is the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges. And there are about 30 of us, no more than one from any state. And since more than 80% of America's college students are, in fact, in public colleges and universities, we are not going to have a liberally educated citizenry if we don't have liberally educated graduates of our public colleges and universities. And so COPLAC, although sort of small, is struggling to say, we in our colleges have a liberal arts basis to our education, and we think that needs to spread to other public institutions. So I think this is probably an institution you will like if you don't know it, and that you will support if you don't know it. So you can check us out. We're, of course, at coplac.org. We don't make a cent. But at any rate, I think you would enjoy learning about it if it's something you don't know about. We need to think carefully about the wisdom of streamlining government if it means the centralization of power and the diminution of local institutions. We should look for ways that can decentralize even certain parts of big cities so that the Big Apple, as well as Geneseo, New York, in those towns, people can participate in their schools for democracy, that is to say, in local government, and have the stimulus to do political associations as well, because they may actually have some impact. We need to address the question of how we get people back into the public square when it seems that the whole world is present in our homes at the click of a mouse or the touching of a screen. Our chat rooms and organizations that exist only online and never face-to-face, able to replace the PTA and the Boy Scouts and the Rotary Club and the Rosary Society and the Elk Club, all of which were so well known in days of yore. If so, they need some grooming so they can play important positive roles in society. If not, what alternatives can we create, or what makeovers can groups that have been around for a long time give themselves so that they can play the same role in a very different society? Do 1,000 channels and 1 billion websites empower us as citizens the way print media did when many of us were young? Does the plethora of websites and cable channels broaden our understanding, or do they encourage that we listen only to those who agree with us? If the latter, how do we create new media that encourage us to look at issues from a variety of perspectives? In that opening quotation of Tocqueville that I read you, written on November 6, 1831, he raised wonderful questions, but then poses one final question. If you recall, it was, who can answer these questions? Well, of course, we know the answer to this. The answer is that we can. We have to take what Tocqueville wrote, and we have to rethink it in light of a very different world. He traveled through rural, small-town America before the Industrial Revolution, when the Erie Canal was the hot news of the day. And we know that the world has changed radically. And so the question is, if Tocqueville is indeed one of those enduring thinkers, and I believe he is, can we stop and refocus what he has to say into questions that help us deal with the real issues of 2012, as he did with issues in his own country as well as the United States in the 1830s? And what I've tried to do is suggest that if we go back and look at what he says about how people become good citizens, schools, public spaces, participation in local government, participation in political associations, participation in civil associations. If we look at those things, how can we reformulate his questions? How can we reproduce some of the genius of America that Tocqueville reported in a world very different than that? If I've been of any help to you in doing that, I will have succeeded. And so I thank you for your work on behalf of the liberal arts in American higher education. I know with me, I got to tell you something that made me crazy. Even though I'm retired, I had 3 of my students over for dinner 2 nights ago, and the number of them who voted was 0. I thought seriously about not giving them dessert. I certainly did chastise them. But we all know that that's not an uncommon situation. And by the way, they all had different reasons, as you can imagine. Didn't get my absentee ballot on time, and so on and so forth. But we know one was a freshman, one was 2 were seniors. And these are bright people. They went to good high schools. They probably had good teachers in high school. They had good teachers in college. We have to ask why it is that participation, even at that very basic level, I always remind them, voting isn't sufficient participation in society. It's just simply one of the things. It's an important one, but if you don't do that one, you probably don't do the others very much. And so we really have to talk about our schools, but also not just our schools, because, again, what Tocqueville emphasized is just what we would expect. The schools sort of set the base. They give the basic knowledge to make, then, the less academic and the more experiential ways of being educated for citizenship. It makes them effective. We start with schools. We don't end with schools. A few years ago, I had the privilege of giving a talk to some youth in Slovakia in a conference called New in the EU. And these were children born just about 1989. That is to say, just about the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism in Eastern Europe. These were from Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. And so, of course, the parents who raised them had no democratic experience. And so I was trying to say some of the things that I thought were important for them to hear about what you do to be a good citizen. And I think I gave them an answer very unexpected. Of course, I said you need to vote and be aware of what you're voting for and against. But I said, if you want to be a good citizen, become a kid's soccer coach. Volunteer to spend the weekend cleaning up the school. Go complain about a pothole. Those are all important democratic things because it helps to build civil society. I was at a conference in Prague recently, and I heard someone speak from one of the new democracies and say, the most important thing we have to do is build civil society. Tocqueville couldn't have said it better. We need, of course, education as the foundation, But we need also to emphasize the role people play daily in their lives in the democratic process. I think Tocqueville has made that clear. I know that your focus, like mine for my entire life, has been on the more formal education, that foundation. But we also need to know that's the beginning. You know, I'm tired of, I've been to too many commencements. I'm tired of commencement speakers saying, commencement, that means beginning. Or, as one of the more cliche-ridden ones a few years ago said, remember that today is the first day of the rest of your life. No kidding. I booed that commencement speaker, but it was not one of my better moments. But we all know that sense that you get your diploma and you're certified educated. We know better than that, and as much as many of you are so interested in college education in particular, as again, I spent my whole life doing that, 42 years in the classroom, we need also to remember that that education continues, and you can help not just by serving on a board of trustees or being an active alumnus, you can serve by being a member of the Rotary Club, or the Rosary Society, or the Fix the Potholes, or the Save the Whales, or whatever. So you want to do it both by the work you do at your colleges and universities and by the example you set every day by being active in those informal schools of democracy as well as in what we hope will more and more become the formal schools for democracy. Thank you very much.